Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Please be sure to download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content, not just Frontline with Joe and Joe. So you get original programming and EWTN programming. And also, if you like what Joe and I do, we go live Thursday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern time. And on social media, X, Rumble, Facebook, and YouTube, where we really get in a lot of trouble. And please, if you like those conversations, share those. Remember, Veritas allows Joe and I to use the interviews for Veritas, and we post those also. So whatever you see that you like that we do, please help us out to reach a wider audience. So today we're going into the breach because, as we always do, but even more so today, because we're going to be talking to Tess Livingstone, who has written a new book. It's out from Ignatius Press. George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, a biography. Like I said, we always emphasize to please support our publishers, Catholic publishers. So please buy it from Ignatius Press. Support Tess by reading the book. It's an important book, which we're going to get into the conversation. And as Father Fessio would want me to say, please make sure you tell your local Catholic bookstore, your local parish bookstore, to order a few copies and put it on the shelf. Okay. And we promise you they're not going to stay there that long. So some of you might be familiar with Tess Livingstone. If not, she is a veteran Australian journalist who's written on politics, economics, strategic policy, and the culture wars. She's written editorials for the Australian and the Weekend Australian since 2007, and was formerly chief of staff, op-ed editor, and education editor for the Courier Mail. Tess Livingstone, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe, our sister.
Thank you very much, Joe and Joe.
Yep. Like I said, I'm going to hand it over to Joe. This is going to be a great conversation. Joe, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yes, we always begin with a prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Tess, I'm a big fan of Cardinal Pell. I read his diary, prison diary, which was published by Ignatius Press. Our friend Joe Fessio was kind enough to send me the book. I think he's an amazing figure. And I think he's someone that the church is going to talk about for a long time. Very gifted man, extremely gifted. Your book traces his life from childhood to when he was named by Pope Francis the treasurer to the Vatican. What was his childhood like? I have some idea because, again, I know a little bit about him, but tell our listeners because I think they may be surprised.
Okay, it was a pretty happy childhood. I interviewed George Pell and his late sister Margaret. They grew up in the Victorian country city of Ballarat. It's somewhat outside the capital, Melbourne. And their father, who was also George Pell, ran a pub, a hotel in the city. And George grew up there. He and Margaret helped out in the bar at weekends. George loved sport as a boy. He was quite sick as a child, and he had to spend a couple of years off school at home, and he became an enormous reader in that time. And then when he got back to school, he was fine again and he thrived. And at St. Patrick's College, Ballarat, he was a very good athlete, a terrific tennis player, a good swimmer, but most of all, he was a good footballer in the game called Australian rules. And at the end of year 10, the college went up to year 12. At the end of year 10, he was picked for the first 18. That was the top team in the school. And football was his great love. He was always a very good scholar at school, and the Christian brothers who taught him were strict, and they made sure he learned his Latin and French and maths and English, and like all the boys at the school, did pretty well. But football was his great interest. And coming towards the end of his year 12, Joe, he was offered a professional football contract, which even back in 1959, 1960 was a very big deal. They only offered them to the best when they're out of school. And George Pell was one of the all-time best. And but he didn't end up taking up that contract much as he wanted to.
Well, thank God, and we'll get into a little bit of that. Tess Livingstone is here at the front line with Joe and Joe. We're discussing her new book, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, a biography. It's available at Ignatius Press. But Tess, finish the rest of the story. Not only did he turn down a contract, but then let our
Yeah.
audience know, what did he do after that?
Well, what he did, he turned down the contract. He turned down the scholarship he'd won to Melbourne University to study law. And there'd been a little idea turning over in his mind for a few months in year 12 that our Lord was calling him to do his work. And he couldn't quite get away from that, even though he was pretty reluctant. He thought that was where his duty belonged. And instead, the year after the school year in Australia finishes just before Christmas each year. And then at the end of the summer holidays in March, he enrolled at the Catholic Seminary in Melbourne to start first year theology, philosophy, first year philosophy there. And he never really looked back. That he'd found his calling.
Well, thank God he didn't look back, because George, like Joe mentioned earlier, he's a towering figure over the last 60, 70 years in the church. And people should know more about him. That's why we would encourage everyone out there to please go buy Tess's book and learn more about this great churchman. That's what he is. And Joe said it right. We'll be talking about Cardinal Pell for a very long time. I'll tell you just from my own personal, before we could continue the interview, Tess. I love the fact, I was saying for a long time, when the new atheists were being very, very aggressive, going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, with Dawkins and Harris and the rest of them, okay?
Oh,
Cardinal
yeah.
Pell had no, I was saying all the time, why are the Protestants, why are they the ones that are debating these aggressive, where are our Catholics? Cardinal Pell took on Richard Dawkins, had no problem doing that whatsoever. I thought it was a great debate. He had no problem getting into the ring with Richard Dawkins and mixing it up, and pushing back. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, he was, look, I think the name of your program, The Front Line, is something that would really appeal to him. He believed in taking the message of Christ into the public square and fighting on the front lines. He often used military analogies, and hence the title of the book, Invictus Pax. And he took on Dawkins on national television on the ABC, which is not always sympathetic to the Christian viewpoint, but to say the least. But he did fine. He wasn't afraid to take on unpopular causes, Joe. When the world was going absolutely crazy about climate change and solutions, and we've got to stop using coal or the planet's going to fry up, etc., etc. George Pell said, look, step back and look at this with some logic and reason. He was, to say the least, a climate change skeptic. He also acknowledged that even if there was something in climate change, that some of the solutions being adopted were going to cause mass poverty across the world. Now, that, as you would know as a Catholic, that stance is not necessarily popular in the Catholic Church these days, but he always said what he thought. And he was not afraid to take on unpopular issues. He took on abortion. He took on same-sex marriage pretty vocally. There was a terrible blasphemous art exhibition at the National Gallery in Victoria when he was Archbishop of Melbourne. He led a crusade against that. But he was also very positive about what the church had to offer young people and what it had to offer people in trouble. He was never afraid of giving out a strong message.
No, that's why he's an inspiration for us all. And Joe and I, like you said, and we thank you for that, Test. That's what we try to do. We want to be able to look at Christ in the face, say, Lord, we opened our mouth. We tried to do something. Okay. And and we think it's just so important. And we could use all, particularly Catholic men, should look at Cardinal Pell, as an inspiration. Like you said, you could call him a culture warrior, okay? But he was also, more importantly, he was on the spiritual front lines, the spiritual battle
He
for
was,
for for
yes.
recognizing that yes, it's a culture war, but the culture war is emanating from a much deeper spiritual battle that's been going on since the garden. But let me hand it over to Joe. Tess Livingstone's here at the front line with Joe and Joe. We're discussing her new book, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, a biography. It's available at Ignatius Press, and I'm sure if you pop it into the Google bar, you could go to one of the larger places. But we'd rather you buy it from the publisher, support the publisher, and ask your local parish bookstore to order a few copies, stock it on the shelf. Joe Resinello.
I want to comment on some things you mentioned. You mentioned a lot of things. First off, he was a gifted person, extraordinarily gifted. And I think people take that for granted. He would have been a multi-millionaire. People like Cardinal George Pell, who were athletic and brilliant, which he was, would have been a multi-millionaire. He was given the keys to the kingdom of this earth and put them on the table. That has to be brought up because I haven't been given those keys, and that is a temptation, a big temptation, and that should be emphasized. I think people very easily can gloss over that. He was called by Christ, and he answered that call, and he put down something that the large majority of us do not have, never will have. No one recruited me to play professional football. I didn't go to those type of schools. I'm just being honest. So this is what this man was. That's first comment. Second comment, you talked about he wasn't afraid. I'm a father. That's my job. I have to protect my children. I have 5 children. That's my job. And God will hold me accountable for that job. That's my
Well,
job.
congratulations on having 5 children. That's wonderful.
Thank you very much. Pray for me. I need prayers.
Don't we
but
all?
with that said, he had a humongous job. He had a humongous job. He was a cardinal. He was gifted and he was prepared to do that job, but he did it. I always say this. Our bishops, they have that crozier. I call it the stick. I'm
Yeah.
Italian from New Jersey. He used it. That is the stick of the shepherd to protect the flock. And that is their job. And that's how God's going to judge them. God's going to judge me too. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm getting judged. I'm standing before the man. So are you.
Yep.
He did that. You see, that's the role of the clergy. These are my children. These are my people. And I'm not going to allow you to hurt them. I see things that they may not. I know the wolves. I know who you are. And that's what he did. And that's what's lacking. I'm going to be honest. We're talking about the front line. Well, I'm going to be very blunt. It's lacking. I don't hear it. In some, I do. In some, I do. In many, I don't. Because there's a cost to doing that. And the cost is he went to jail. That was a cost. I think that's my opinion. You know more than me. You researched his life. I think that's why he went to jail. Talk about that role of the clergy, because that is your job, just like I have a job to protect my children.
Well, absolutely, Joe. He was prepared to do his job. For example, seminary rebuilding would be a very good example. Before he became a bishop, he was rector of the Melbourne Seminary for 3 years. And he tried to make reforms in the seminary. It was a fairly avant-garde era. He wanted students going to mass every morning. He wanted more prayer in the seminary. And he set about making what he put up a list on the board called a few small changes. Well, some of those changes did not go down very well with a lot of the seminarians, but he stuck by them. But he very quickly realised when he was doing that reform was essential from the top, that it would take a bishop or an archbishop to bring in the kind of seminary reforms that were needed. And when he became Archbishop of Melbourne, that became one of his 1996. Reforming the seminary was one of his major priorities, even with even younger people than student priests. He was very concerned when he became Archbishop of Melbourne. There were no religious textbooks in Catholic schools in the Archdiocese and indeed in most dioceses throughout the country. he set about having a set of very, very good religious textbooks written and illustrated and done in a way that was very attractive to the students. To know, worship, and love. The series is. He drew in Monsignor Peter Elliott to help him with those books. They're still around and they're used in many dioceses in Australia now. He was very concerned about the poor catechetics in the schools. He thought young people weren't getting the grounding in the faith that they needed, and he was determined to do something about that. So yes, he also brought in fairly major reforms to the seminary in Sydney when he was promoted from Archbishop of Melbourne to Archbishop of Sydney in 2001. And as well as that, he set up university chaplaincies on campus at the main Sydney universities for Catholic students. And it really revitalised the Catholic life in those institutions. He was a builder at all times. He saw the value in Pope John Paul II's push with World Youth Day. He was an active participant in World Youth Days. He took groups of 300 or 400 young people to various World Youth Days in Rome, in Cologne, in Germany. Then, of course, there was the great World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008. So he really took the message out to the ends of the earth. And I remember one of his most startling sermons he gave was at the opening Mass of World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008. And he said, "This sermon is directed not at the 99 sheep who are okay, but at the one who's feeling lost, lonely, defeated, hurt, empty." He absolutely took the message to the ends of the earth. He had an incredible rapport, actually, with the homeless. People don't realise that. They think because he was a rather stern figure, and rightly so, in standing up for Catholic truth and doctrine, he had a huge pastoral heart as well. And I think that some of that came from the fact that for 9 years as an auxiliary bishop, he ran the Australian Catholic aid agency, Veritas, and he worked on the front lines in Vietnam, Cambodia, India after earthquakes. He went to China. He didn't spare himself in that work at all, Joe. He really did take the message and the compassion and goodness of Christ to all comers, and that was his message. He also, when he came to Sydney, because he was a high-profile, controversial figure, he was offered a weekly column in the local Sunday secular newspaper, which was the largest selling newspaper in Australia at the time, the Sunday Telegraph. And he did a very engaging job with that. He picked up thousands of readers and followers there. So he never really missed an opportunity to take the authentic message of Christ out to the people.
Yeah, Tess Livingstone is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy her new book, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictis, a biography, available at Ignatius Press. You know, something you said, Tess, is sticking in my mind, and I want you to comment on it. When a priest or a bishop or a cardinal, when they're not firm, like you mentioned, you used the word stern, okay? But that's what we need in the church. All those things you mentioned, working in Cambodia and Vietnam with the poor, everything he's doing for the youth and all that, that flows from your firmness in the faith. See, it's something that, from my point of view as a Catholic man, okay, I could look up to, I could rely on, I could depend on, because I know that's somebody who's rooted. He's like rock. His faith is so firm, he's like rock. And then all the good works, all the things he might do, flow forth from that. I'm sorry, Tess, I'm going to get a little like Joe crazy. All right. But when you're squishy in the faith, I'm sorry, that's where the problems arise. That's where we go off the rails in the Catholic Church. Go ahead, Tess. You know where I'm going.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of examples of that, Joe, on both sides of the Pacific, I think. And yeah, he was never wishy-washy. People know where he stood. And where he stood was with the apostolic tradition. He often made the point, look, I'm not here to teach my own teachings. I'm here to teach the faith. And he was firm in that. He was very compassionate. He had a great sense of humor. He enjoyed life to the full, but yeah, he never wavered in his faith. And he wasn't afraid to call things out in the church when he didn't like them and think they were and thought they were wrong.
No, absolutely, and we'll get into that. A lot of people speculate that's one of the reasons that led to him, going to prison and some other hardships he had to endure. You're joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. I'm going to hand it over to Joe Resinello.
It's funny, Tess. In some of the comments you made, you mentioned Peter Elliott. He actually was on our show. He wrote a book on the sexual revolution, phenomenal book. And it's funny, during that interview, I referred to him as Your Excellency. And after the interview, he's like, "You gave me a promotion," but he like that's not my title. But he mentioned Cardinal Pell. He said he's my friend, and he said he
Yes.
would have loved. Honestly, he said he would have loved this conversation because that book was in your face. I don't know if people know about that book or if you know
Mm.
about, I'm sure you know about it. You want to comment on it? It was a
I
great
do,
book. It
yeah,
was a
I
great
know
interview.
Bishop Elliot. Cardinal Pell actually brought Bishop Elliot into the Catholic Church. You might not know that, but
I did not
when
Did
actually.
not know that.
okay, when they were both students at Oxford, after leaving Propaganda Fide in Rome, George Pell was sent to Oxford to do a doctorate in church history. And he met a young Anglican there by the name of Peter Elliot at a gathering for Australians. And they became friends. And he never really put pressure on Peter Elliot to join the church. But I think just through example and osmosis, it rubbed off. And Peter Elliot came to him one day very serious and he said, look, I've decided to convert. And George Pell stood by him at his confirmation and his induction into the church. And Peter Elliot went on to become he's retired now, but he went on to become a very substantial bishop. One of George Pell's talents was to get the best out of different people in different ways. And I think Bishop Elliot was a prime example of that.
What's funny is that Joe and I comment all the time, Tess, on the show. It does seem like there's lately been several high-profile conversions to the Catholic Church. And of course, that's all God's hand. But the thing is, like when you talk about somebody like Peter Elliott coming into the Catholic Church, that idea that Cardinal Pell rubbed off on him. Isn't that
He
what
did,
we're
yes.
all supposed to do? Because from my own personal point of view, yes, we're supposed to open our mouths. Yes, we're supposed to fight these fights and fight these battles. And it's a great example to others to do so. But ultimately, people are going to look at the way you live your life. And if and it's living that Catholic life, letting the faith come out of you, not with a club over the head, but just people see you just living your daily life, and they somehow know you're
Mm.
Catholic, and
They
that
yeah,
rubs
they
off. I love your
recognize he
comments on
was
that, Tess.
authentic. That's right. Yeah, yes, people recognize that Cardinal Pell was authentic. And he wasn't afraid either to put things in perspective at times. He stuck to the things that matter most, the love of God, keeping the commandments, the sanctity of life. He didn't get what would be the word? He didn't get too caught up in debates about issues, minor issues. For example, one of the famous columns he wrote for his Sunday Telegraph column was he read the first Harry Potter book and went to see the movie. And there were lots of people, lots of Christians, not just Catholics either, but Protestants too, who were very wary of the witchcraft in that. And he just said, look, I think it's a good story. I enjoyed it. And that just, parents breathed a sigh of relief. So, they didn't have to, panic if their kids picked up Harry Potter and read it. He would be in favor of young people reading a lot of different books, and he understood very well, as most parents do, that the minute you ban something, nothing becomes as desirable to the child as what you've banned. He took a very mature sort of an attitude. He was critical of some aspects of popular culture in his Telegraph column too. One of the things he was very critical of, for example, was one of Dan Brown's novels. He absolutely hated it. And it's very ironic, Joe. It's quite funny. One of the things he objected to was a scene in Dan Brown's novel where there was a bishop running around Europe with a suitcase full of banknotes. And he said, "Oh, that's terrible. That wouldn't happen. That's not plausible," etc., etc. The irony of that is he had to eat his words later. When he joined the Vatican as Vatican treasurer, it opens chapter 4 in the book. It talks about his two staff were sitting near a beautiful picture of Mary Immaculate, counting out around 200,000 euros that a very senior churchman was ready to leave the premises with. So, truth turned out to be stranger than fiction.
Well, we're definitely Tess Livingstone. We're definitely going to get into that on the other side of the break. Let's take a quick break here at the front line with Joe and
Thank
Joe.
you.
So, Tess, we've told the audience we know that they could buy the book at Ignatius Press. They could ask their local parish bookstore. Where else could our audience buy the book, and where else could they follow you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I write for The Australian and The Weekend Australian, which is a sister paper to the Wall Street Journal and The Times in London. I normally write about politics and economics and foreign affairs. Occasionally, I write church articles if they're of interest. And yeah, I mean, The Australian is a great reader. I think it's one of the world's great newspapers. So there's a plug for my organisation. But also, I edited a couple of Cardinal Pell's other books for Ignatius Press: Test Everything, Hold Fast to What Is True. That's a collection of his writings, and yeah, they can buy that from Ignatius as well. So, but this book is the one that's really it's taken me 2 years to do. He died 2 years ago in a couple of days on the 9th of January, which was a surprise. So, yeah, I hope people go out and get a copy and read it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're hoping for. Tess Livingstone is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. So we're discussing her new book, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictus, a biography, available at Ignatius Press. So stick around with us here at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network. Remember, if you're either listening to this on the radio or you're watching it on social media, please share it. Download the app, particularly with Veritas, so that you get access to all of our station's content and you have all the prior episodes of Bishop Caggiano, Joe and Joe, and all the great shows and original programming from Veritas Catholic Radio Network. So, like I said, stick around for another great segment with Tess Livingstone. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe, Joe Pasillo, Joe Rossinello, and we are way in the breach with Tess Livingstone. We're discussing her new book from Ignatius Press, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictus, a biography. Joe Rossinello, where do you want to start this segment?
I want to talk about his role with Pope Francis as the new Vatican Secretary to the Economy. I think Francis, one of the reasons from what I've read that he was chosen to be the Pope is he's a good administrator. That was his MO. And I think, that is why one of the reasons, obviously I wasn't in the conclave, but that's what I have
You
read.
weren't? I thought you
No,
might
they
have
haven't
invited
they
you.
haven't asked me yet. But maybe one day. But anyway, so here he is. He gets chosen. I could see why he would be chosen. He's a big man. I would assume Francis chose him because probably he is a person of great integrity. You put someone in charge of the money who is very honest, and I'm sure he had that reputation. This is the interesting part. I was an auditor for many years, and this is what I found to be interesting. When he had that role, he would ask for documents. And as an auditor, that's what you do. I worked as an auditor in finance on Wall Street.
Mm.
And I, wasn't a senior person at the bank, but I would deal with very senior people. And if they didn't want to give me something, I just went above their head. I'd go to my boss, he'd go to their boss, and it would come to me. Now, this is in the corporate field. This isn't the church. You would think that if I ask for something in the church, you're a cardinal, and I say, I need your records because I'm going to review them. And he wanted to hire as a consultant, I believe, a public accounting firm, the Big Four, great reputation, very qualified people. These are not like, these are serious people, professionals, CPAs, great degrees. They wouldn't give him the documents. Like that. Please comment on that because I can't wrap my hands around that as an auditor. And I've had my fights with senior people at banks who are very rich.
Yes.
Please talk
Look,
about
Joe,
that.
absolutely. It would seem incredible to someone of your background, as indeed it did to Danny Casey, who was one of the senior administrators from the Archdiocese of Sydney, who went to Rome with the Cardinal to work with him. Look, a couple of things about the documents. A lot of documents that should have existed simply didn't. For example, there were around 80 properties throughout Rome owned by the canons of St. Peter's that were supposed to be bringing in income. No one had a list of them. And some of them had just fallen off the books. When the Cardinal got there, he found there was no inventory of the church's precious artworks, for example. A lot of it was just incompetence. And look, I've got to say, Pope Francis made a brilliant choice in hiring George Pell. He knew he was forceful and he was competent. Remember, he'd built Domus Australia, the Australian guest house in Rome, and a beautiful job had been done on it. And it came in on budget and it worked very well. So Francis was right doing that. But somehow, when Cardinal Pell and Danny Casey and those they were working with, including Libero Maloney, needed to see other documents, oh, no, they're off the books, they're private. It was quite extraordinary. His whole mission was to bring the Vatican up to professional accounting standards that you've just described, that would apply on Wall Street, that would apply anywhere in the real world. And unfortunately, the old guard in the Vatican was having none of it. They didn't want it. You'll see in the book there are some extraordinary incidents there where another cardinal actually said to one of the staff who was working with George Pell in a rather sinister voice, "You have 3 children, do you?" And the man said, "No, I have 4. Oh, he said, "George Pell won't be here forever." Now, there were covert threats like that going on. George Pell's office, which was in a tower at the back of the Vatican complex, was broken into within days of him arriving there. Bugs were found on his telephones and on his home telephones. These people were determined. He closed several thousand accounts at the Vatican Bank, Joe, early on, because, you and I can't just walk off the street and open a Vatican Bank account. You've got to have some association with the church. But somehow there were thousands of bank accounts at the Vatican that had no association with the church. And Cardinal Pell suspected that some of them were there for money laundering purposes. And when he closed a lot of those accounts, he called in authorities for 200 of the owners of those accounts. So it was an extraordinary situation that he was confronted with there. And not only was the old guard upset at the thought of an external auditor being appointed, they weren't too pleased when an internal auditor, Libero Maloney, was appointed as well. It was an extraordinary time. Slowly but surely, I believe the foundations he laid are starting to bear fruit, and it's coming right, which they need to, because the Vatican could be in a lot of financial trouble paying out pensions for its staff if it really doesn't get its financial priorities in order.
Tess, let me just comment on that again as an auditor and a person that works in banking. If you don't give me my documents, you're fired. You see, this is what I don't understand. In my world, that's what happens. You get fired. And that's what should happen. And I don't understand how that's not happening. Let me publicly say that, because that's what should happen. Everyone has a boss in life, even if we have to go up to the Pope. Listen, this guy's not giving me the documents. You are giving me the documents, or you're fired. That's number one. Number two, the church is rich. All you have to do is hire someone like McKinsey, which is a humongous firm, global firm. Brilliant people work there. They're consultants. They've handled bigger jobs than the Catholic Church. They handle jobs all over the world. Brilliant people. You hire their services. They come on board and they review everything. Everything becomes transparent. Now, here's the good news. When everything becomes transparent, people have confidence in the institution, and then people give money because they have confidence in the institution. That's what bankers do. Listen, if you're a rich person and I'm your broker and you trust me because I'm good to you and I'm honest and I'm always on the ball, you're going to, of course, do business with me because you trust me, because I have your interest.
You trust a good broker to invest your money. Look, and I think it's important, Joe, you mentioned the magic words, give money. Now, the church, of course, runs on the good graces of individuals through the Peter's Pence collection, on very generous fundraisers, including in the United States, that raise money for various Vatican projects. But one of the things the Cardinal had terrible trouble getting through, and in fact didn't get through, was he looked at the Peter's Pence collection, that we all are asked to contribute to once a year. And he said, look, I like to wind back the amount of this collection that is spent on administration, initially to 75%, 50%, and 25%. Now, as a Catholic in the pews, the thought that 75% of what I give is going on administration rather than good causes, that he really wanted, he took Pope Francis's concern and priority for the poor to heart. And he said, greater accountability and greater competence in money management will maximize the resources for the poor. But no, that was opposed by a little coterie of old guard cardinals. They didn't think that the amount spent on administration of Peter's Pence should be reduced. It's extraordinary, Joe, what he found there. And then, there were those extraordinary scandals over that Sloane Avenue property in London. Look, the place needed an absolute overhaul. And he certainly set that up, I think.
Well, Tess, stay there 1 second. Didn't the work that he did in that role lead to, well, you talk about who got arrested. Who eventually got arrested? Was it Cardinal Betchu? Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
You are pronouncing it correctly, Joe. And yeah, Cardinal Betchu did stand trial. Yes, he did. Other figures in the Vatican, lay associates, I think there are around 9 of them, stood trial on corruption issues. That the guilty verdicts actually came down on the 16th of December, which was George Pell's ordination day, about a year after he died. Yeah, they did. Some people, what you could be referring to, some people claim that Cardinal Pell's work in the Vatican contributed to the problems he had in Australia. Look, he wondered that. Many people have tried to investigate it, including very, very good journalists on my newspaper, The Australian. And it's very hard to find the smoking gun, Joe. But these people are clever. They're used to moving
they're
money
extreme.
around.
Tess, I'm reminded. I'm just because the thought comes into my head. I'm reminded of the story when over a very long time ago, when Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was going to be screened. I think it was either Rochester or Buffalo or Albany, somewhere in New York, I believe. And one of the reporters told Orson Welles after the screening, said, "Don't go back to your hotel room." And he's like, "Why?" He goes, "Because
Mm.
you're going to get set up. There's underage. They put underage kids there with pornography and everything else, and the reporters were already."
Mm.
And he stayed away. I'm reminded of that. I don't know all the facts, Tess. I don't, and I'm not going to pretend to. Nobody's going to tell me that the work that Cardinal Pell was doing, when you're talking about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that the church controls, that Cardinal Pell is trying to shed the light on and increase transparency and trust and confidence, as you two were both discussing. Okay, no,
Mm.
my father told me a long time. He goes, "Listen, Joe, people will kill you for a nickel. Don't think if you're threatening people for lots of money or how they're making lots of
Yeah.
money that you won't be in a lot of trouble." I firmly believe that Cardinal Pell was set up. I don't have any evidence for that, Test, but in my heart of hearts, knowing the type of man he was, no, he went to jail because somebody wanted him in jail. So I'd love your comments on that.
Look, no one, Joe, unfortunately, no one knows for sure. I wish I could have solved that dilemma in this book, but I couldn't. And hopefully one day it will be solved. But you've also got to bear in mind, though, Joe, that the Victoria Police in the state where he grew up, Victoria, Australia's second largest state population wise, they had launched Operation Tethering, it was called. Like, you'd tether a wild cow or a wild bull or wild animal of some sort. They launched Operation Tethering against George Pell in 2013. Now, that was a long time before Francis appointed him to the Vatican. It was a full year before. And Operation Tethering was really, as Pell's barrister said during the trial, it was a get Pell exercise. There were no complaints. Police had received no complaints about him. So the Victoria Police set about trying to find some complaints about him. And then eventually that extraordinary accusation about the cathedral came forward, and nobody initially took it seriously. George Pell thought it was beyond crazy, but it all turned out very badly for him. And whether there was involvement from European criminal money as the process went along, no one really knows, Joe. There was a couple of $100,000 that came into Australia that wasn't really very well accounted for, but it's very hard to find out what was point A and what was the final destination of that money.
All right, like you said, you're dealing with clever people. Tess Livingstone joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy the book, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictus, a biography. It's available at Ignatius Press. You could ask your local bookstore, Catholic bookstore, stock a couple or a few copies on the shelves. And I'm sure if you pop it into the Google bar, there will be other places where you could go and buy it. Tess, I'm correct in that, right? I'm sure you could buy it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Yes, it's on Amazon US, Joe,
Uh,
definitely.
all right, thank you for that. I'm going to hand it over to Joe Resinello.
Yes, I want to talk about the time he spent in prison. Because again, I think when people hear of a public figure like Cardinal Pell, they think he would go to like some cushy jail. He went to real jail. I read the book. He was living in a quad with like criminals, real criminals.
Oh yeah, he was in a very high secure unit, Joe. He never actually when he was at the Melbourne Assessment Centre, he heard the other criminals. He never encountered them. He was isolated for most of the time he was in, basically for his own protection. But yeah, he went to real jail. He readily admitted that the thing he found hardest about it were the strip searches, not just when he went in, he expected that, but anytime his family came to see him, he had to go through one then, I think, before he could see them and afterwards. Yeah, he was very lonely in there. He wasn't able to celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass in jail at all. He attended Mass, I think, around 6 times in more than a year, when I think at one stage Archbishop Comensoli came in to see him. At another stage, I think a priest friend came and said Mass for him, but he had to rely on the breviary and the Bible and his own prayers and writing the prison journals, which I think was some sort of spiritual salvation for him.
I want to talk about that a little bit because, like, I've read the works of Cardinal Nguyen. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm always good for mispronunciation. He was a
I
Vietnamese
know who you
card.
mean, the Vietnamese. Oh, yeah.
Correct. He
George
spent
Pell was very fond of him. There's a
phenomenal.
portrait.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a
but
portrait of Cardinal Nguyen, I don't know how to say it either, on the wall of Domus Australia in Rome because he was one of Pell's heroes. Yeah.
phenomenal. Spent 13 years in prison. I personally believe, like, this is me. Obviously, I'm just talking, but God used that time to prepare him for heaven. I believe that. Like, it made him even more close to God when you go through such a purifying situation. Because one
Mm.
could say, like, why did this happen? How could this happen? That's my thinking on it. He went through something that's just unconceivable, like you can't even wrap your arms around it, but he did. Um, After he came out of that, what's your takeaway on how he changed? Because such an experience, just from a human being's perspective, you're going to change. You go through, a situation like that. What do you think, like, changed in him?
His personality didn't change. He kept his sense of humor. I think he was warier of, for example, the state of Victoria. He was warier. He became a bit more outspoken about things going on in the church if he didn't approve of them. He was not a fan of synodality, as you'd be well aware. And even the week he died, he actually wrote a scathing article about the upcoming synod, what was then the upcoming synod on synodality for the Spectator in London. He wrote the famous Demos memo, where he was pointing out a few areas where the church needed to lift its game, both spiritually and being more outspoken on the big political issues of the day, such as the Ukraine war, for example. I think he mentioned that, and putting the financial house in order. I think he became more willing to speak out on church issues. He valued his friends more than ever, and he was just so good at keeping in touch with people after that. And he wanted to do all that he could. I remember one of the issues that came up at the time was when Pope Benedict died, Cardinal Pell was in Rome, and he had a function that night for Cardinal Zen, the 90-year-old Hong Kong cardinal. And that was just a magic thing to do because he was very concerned about the underground church in China that he had visited. And he was no great fan of the church's pact, the Vatican's pact with the regime of Xi Jinping. And he made that pretty clear. He took on the Secretary of State at one stage, who was concerned about the AUKUS agreement. That's a defence agreement, as you know, between the United States and Australia and Britain, to do with defending the Pacific with nuclear-powered submarines. And the church was concerned that that would promote war. Cardinal Pell said, no, both sides of Australian politics see the value of this. It's important. I think he was becoming more outspoken, which is interesting. He wanted to be in Rome for the next conclave to address the cardinals before they went in to vote. He couldn't vote himself. He was over 80, but he was very determined to have his say about who should be the next pope, or rather, not so much who, but what kind of qualities were needed.
Absolutely. Tess Livingstone, let me ask you this. What is the state of Catholic life in Australia right now from your vantage point?
Oh, that's a good question, Joe. A lot of parish priests are working very hard and doing their best. Um, there is a terrible falling off when students leave Catholic schools after 12 years. It's fair to say the vast majority are not practicing the faith within 6 months of leaving school, assuming their mum and dad made them go to mass during the time they were living with them at school. Um, the schools, ironically, though, are very popular because they've got good values, good discipline. They teach well. The the church has taken a pretty strong stand against voluntary euthanasia, which is a very big issue in Australia. I think Cardinal Pell has made the brave bishops a bit braver. Most of them prefer a quiet life, but he has made the brave ones a bit braver.
No, absolutely. Tess Livingstone's here at the front line with Joe and Joe. We have probably time for one more question, Joe Rossinello. What would you like to where would you like to go, Joe?
Do you think he will be potentially viewed as a saint, canonized, a person like this? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Oh, that's a hard one to answer because if I say yes outright, I will be absolutely crucified by the left. Look, at his funeral in St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, the former Prime Minister of Australia, no less, Tony Abbott, suggested that he would. I think he's got many of the heroic qualities of a saint. I think it will be difficult, though, Joe, to be honest, because like a lot of bishops of his era in Australia, the United States, and elsewhere, he inherited a frightful mess in terms of sex abuse, and no one could do everything possible to fix that. And there were controversies around that. I think people will bring that up for a long time, but I think in the overall scheme of things in years to come, I think, well, people are already praying to him now to intercede. His tomb in the crypt beneath St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney is already a place of pilgrimage. I think a lot of people already see him that way. Whether it becomes official or not, we've just got to wait and see.
What do you think his main legacy is going to be?
Um, I think his main legacy is underlying the value of the Catholic faith for individuals, for families, and in the public square in influencing the conduct of public life.
Well, I'll tell you this. Joe mentioned the Cardinals crozier earlier. Well,
Mm,
George Cardinal Pell was one of those people that used that stick. Okay. See, I want to be. I know I'm a 57-year-old man, Tess, but I want my church. I want the men in the church. I want them to protect me. Yeah, there's a lot of wolves
yeah.
out there. Joe's got 5 kids. I have a 15-year-old son. Okay. I have to
Mm,
protect my son, but I need protection from the church. Cardinal Pell was one of those people that I wanted to know what he had to say. Like if there's a
that's right.
story in the news about what's going on. Well, what did Cardinal Pell say about it? Amongst others. I'm not saying only
Yeah,
Cardinal Pell, but amongst us, because you know why? Because I know they use that stick. Okay.
that's
And that
right.
stick protects
And he
me and
had
my family.
credibility and strength. Yes.
Tess,
Yeah.
what's your final word for our audience here at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network?
I think my final word would be his life was an inspiring one. He made the absolute best use of his abundant gifts. He never backed away from a fight or controversy. And I hope people find something of interest to read in the book.
And Tess, I'm absolutely certain that they will. We would encourage everyone out there to please go and buy this book. The author is Tess Livingstone, who was gracious enough to join the front line with Joe and Joe from Ireland, no less. It's a book itself is available at Ignatius Press. The title, George Cardinal Pell, Pax Invictus, a biography. Now you can buy it from the publisher. We would encourage you to do so. Also, ask your local parish bookstore to stock a few copies on the shelf, and you can pop it into the Google search bar, and it's going to come up because you could buy it at one of the larger retailers. But like we say, we want to support our local businesses, our Catholic businesses like our publishers. Tess Livingstone, this has been a wonderful and enlightening conversation for
Oh,
both Joe and
thank
I
you,
and
Joe
our
and Joe.
audience.
I've really enjoyed it. It's really interesting. And I'm just blown away by the interest in Cardinal Pell in America. His fame certainly spread and his writings. He was very well known on that side of the Pacific, and it just makes me doubly proud of him.
Absolutely, and like I said, Tess, we're gonna keep having these conversations. You're gonna keep writing books. We're gonna keep going into the breach. And needless to say, you are welcome back here anytime. This is a great conversation, and
Thank
we
you,
look forward
Joe.
to having you back in the future.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Joe and Joe.
You're welcome, Tess. And thank you all out there for joining us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Please download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content, not just the front line with Joe and Joe. And if you like what we do, we go live Thursday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, where we go across Rumble, Facebook, X, YouTube, the whole nine yards. If you like these interviews, if you like those shows, please share them. Share them. Let's get out to a wider audience. Thank you already for your support. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.